Hello there, Mr. Lee here, and welcome to the second presentation on prayer and sacrifice. Now, in the last presentation, you would have looked at some of the reasons why Greeks and Romans would interact with their gods, and in this session, we're going to focus on how the Romans and the Greeks prayed and sacrificed. So I suppose you get from the title a sense that actually sometimes a Roman or a Greek might pray, and sometimes they might sacrifice. How would a Roman or Greek decide whether a prayer or a sacrifice is necessary? How would they decide between the two? Here's a question for you. I suppose it depends on the wishes they have, or how much favor they want to gain from the gods, or what it is exactly that they want to achieve, or what they have achieved in the scale of it. But one thing that you shouldn't forget as well is that, well, the gods are understanding, and there are stories that shows that the gods are understanding, and they understand that if the people want to show favor, they do it within their resources. So a bit like taxation, really. If someone is less well off and they give less to the gods would see it as the less well off people giving up a greater proportion of what they've got. They would understand that, so they wouldn't judge like for like, but they would consider the circumstances. If you can't afford to sacrifice a live animal, and most ordinary citizens wouldn't, the gods wouldn't necessarily judge you worse off if what you're giving up is the equivalent amount of devotion or resource as someone who's rich. So if a rich person were just to pray for something that's really important, I suppose they wouldn't necessarily see it as favourable compared to a less well-off person just praying for something that they hope to achieve. Talking about prayers, the way that you pray is you actually you could just pray in many ways, but generally to signify to the gods that you're praying, you would hold your hands up with your palm pointing upwards for the Olympian gods. If you are interested to know more, there are a different way of praying to the gods of the underworld, Hades or Pluto, and Persephone as well. So, but we're going to focus on praying to the Olympian gods. You could do that anywhere, and if you want to make it more formal, you can even kneel on the ground, or in extreme cases, you can lie completely flat on the ground, with your hands still pointing upwards, or perhaps directed towards a statue of the gods. The idea of holding your hand up is partly because that's where the gods are, but you might even kneel down as well to show the sense of respect that you might have, and to show that you're subservient to the gods. You are below them in the hierarchy. Sacrifice. There are 3 types of sacrifice I would like us to have a look at, and the first type is libation. I wonder if you could see what that man in the figure is doing there. The object that he's holding is quite significant. He's holding a bowl over the altar, and even though it doesn't quite depict it in this image, he's pouring wine over the altar, and this is an offering of wine to the gods to gain faith, well, for whatever reasons that he might have to ask the gods to gain favour. You might also have a votive offering. This is an example of one such offering discovered in Bath. This was thrown into the well as an offering to the gods. I think it's a jewelry of some sort. And you would dedicate it to the gods perhaps as a deposit for them doing something for you, or as a payment of thanks, or just to be on their good sides. Finally, and perhaps what we associate most in terms of to the Greeks in terms of sacrifice, and to the Romans as well, is a blood sacrifice. Blood sacrifice refers to the killing of animals. Very, very, very rarely humans, but killing of animals for the gods, and typically the animal about to be offered to the gods is known as a victim. Sometimes there can be as many as 100 animals being offered up, and that would be called a hecatomb. In the case of the festival of Olympia, 100 oxen is offered at the site of the Olympic festival, the Olympic Games, as a sacrifice to Zeus. As you can see from the three types of sacrifice, and hecatomb is a type of blood sacrifice, different people will have different resources available to them, and it'll be for different reasons. Quite clearly, to offer a hecatomb, 100 oxen for the gods, you're more likely to be perhaps a very, very rich individual, but perhaps a state as well. With something like the organizing committee of the Olympic Games in ancient times, perhaps you'll be sponsored by other states who wants to, I suppose, sponsor the events. If they show that they're the persons funding this, paying for it, I suppose they would get some recognition amongst the Greeks, as well as some recognition for the gods. But really, when you talk about blood sacrifices, you're thinking of very wealthy individuals, or someone with influence, or indeed estates themselves. Now, we can sort of divide up looking at sacrifice in terms of its planning, preparation, in terms of the kill, and what happens afterwards. It's always really divided into these three types, because the whole thing is very ritualistic. From this point on, I'm really talking about blood sacrifice because that's the most ritualistic part of it all, and is the most significant sacrifice. By significant, I mean ones that really people of modern times are most interested in, and one that would feature more in your exam course. Ritual is anything that you would do in a proper way to make sure that its effect is fully achieved. There's a significance in doing in a proper way, and we tend to use the word ritual to associate with religious activities. Proper procedures must be followed, and in the case of a Roman or Greek sacrifice, the participants must observe it solemnly as well. This often means in silence. It's quite unfortunate really, but if anyone makes a significant amount of noise, then the whole thing might have to be restarted again. If the noise or any activity startles the victim, then the whole thing will need to restart again. If someone sneezes, that could perhaps lead to a restarting of the whole sacrifice. It is important. People see it as ritualistic. People see it as something to be done seriously. So, because they have the respect for the gods, with the exception perhaps of an event like the festival of the Lupercalia, which you will study later on. The god is a bit less serious in the festival of Lupercalia, so they thought they could be less serious in the way that they do a sacrifice. Otherwise, solemnly done. Now, if you do have a worksheet or a sort of OneNote work, you should have the following activity in front of you. Essentially, each of those events they match on with one of the symbolism on the right hand side. So I guess each event is significant. So there are two things you need to do in this activity, and the instructions are also on your worksheet. One is to try to order the events from 1 to 4, and then afterwards with the same number that you've ordered the event, please match, like write the same number on the symbolism depending on which event you feel has which symbolism. So for example, if you feel that let me give you a clue. If you feel that offerings should be put on the altar of grapefruit cakes. Yes, if you feel that should happen first, and indeed it does, then put that as number 1, and then the relevant symbolism for that is the idea of a bloodless offering, payments to priest initiates main sacrifice. So you put that on the same one on the right hand side as well. So pause the video if you need, give yourself a bit of time, and complete this activity. Okay, before we go through the answers, just want to say I've borrowed this activity from Mrs. Jenkinson Brown, which you may have seen me use her PowerPoints on some of the other videos. So just as a thank you for creating this resource, or at least directing me to it. The first activity, as we've found, is the offerings of food items. The second activity is the offering of liquid poured offering, or libation perhaps. Then we have the slaughter of the victim, and then we have the burning of parts of the victim on the altar, and the symbolism is written on the side. Now the symbolism is something that might help you explain why sacrifice is as important. So even though it isn't necessarily something that at a basic level you need to know for the exam, it is, however, something that would enhance your knowledge of it and would impress the examiners with your depth of knowledge, as is the next activity, also borrowed from Mrs. Jenkinson Brown. Which animals do the gods prefer? Now, I'm not necessarily expecting that you would know the answer to these, but it might be quite fun to guess. If you could work with someone else while you're watching this video to complete this, then great, more the merrier. But again, pause the video and we'll check through the answers in a moment. Okay, so we start with I think that's a horse, isn't it? The horse is for Poseidon, because aside from the god of the sea, he is also the god of horses. For the dog, it would be Hecate. For the donkey, it would be Apollo. And for the pig, it would be Demeter. For the ox, it will be Dionysus, Heracles, Apollo, Athena, and Zeus, which means, oh, this is going to be a tough one. The cockerel is going to be for Asclepius, and I suppose all these answers would apply for their Roman counterparts. So see if you can work out what the Roman names are as a bit of an extra challenge. But if you don't feel like doing that, then we will move on to in fact, do it, because it's like a revision, right? We'll move on to the 3 main parts of sacrifice, and they are the preparation, the kill, and the sharing of the sacrifice, as we've mentioned before. Now, if you don't want to listen to me blabbering on, if this is a typical lesson, what I would typically advise you to do now is to use pages 46 to 48 and 60 to 61 of the official textbook to make notes on the process of Greek and Roman sacrifice. If you have the resource available for you, I would still advise you to use the textbook, partly to break it up, partly to give you a bit of time to think to yourself and to ask any questions of anything that you're unsure, rather than frantically listening to me noting down notes. And I'll happily answer your questions, send them in to me, and I'll try my best to find the answer. One thing to look out for is that the exam board expects you to be able to compare the differences between Greek and Roman sacrifice. I'm not sure if they... the difficulty I found with this part, personally, is that I don't think the Greeks and the Roman sacrifice procedures are that different, even though in the textbook it lists the procedures of how the Romans sacrifice and how the Greeks sacrifice. I can't see any obvious difference. I'm not someone who's dedicated their whole life to researching Greek and Roman sacrifices, arguably there's more of a variation between different festivals than there are between the Greeks and the Romans themselves. But because an important part of this course is to be able to compare, contrast, and perhaps make preferences between how the Greeks do something and how the Romans do something, even if it seems repetitive, it'll be important for you to note down both the Greek and Roman process. So, if you're heading to the textbook, great. When you do come back, you can either start at this point or you can skip all the way to the end of where I explain how a sacrifice works. Otherwise, here goes the explanation. We start with the preparation of the sacrifice. Now, just a reminder that sacrifice is a very ritualistic set of procedures, and they must be completed solemnly. Some of the things that you must make sure you do to show you're ready for this sacrifice event is that you must be clean or free of pollution, and you must wear your best clothes. Now, by clean, you would remember when we studied Greek temples that as you enter into the sanctuary, there often is a place for you to wash and clean your hands anyway. If this is an important sacrifice, it is advised that whatever you wear and your body is clean as well. Because gods are very pure beings, so I suppose you're just mirroring that. In terms of the victim, the offering, they are typically decorated with ribbons, a bit like wrapping a present. If they have horns, like an ox or a goat, you might have them gilded, which is covered in a thin layer of gold. And once they are suitably decorated, they'll be led to the altar by the attendants, preferably willingly. I don't mean the attendants willingly leading the victim, I mean the animal themselves. They don't struggle on the way there, they're quite happily led to the altar. Now, this is why that last point about noise might scare the animal is important, because we don't want to startle them, we don't want to give the animals some inkling that they're going to be killed. So aside from the fact that silence would probably be enforced, you also have a musician playing some sort of background music, and what that would do is it would to a certain degree drown out any noise that participants have inadvertently made by accident. Maybe a quiet sneeze or a quiet cough wouldn't be heard by the animals, or maybe some faraway sound wouldn't be heard by the animals in order to startle it. And once we're at the altar, we can start going into this sort of most significant part, the climax of the sacrifice. So here we are at the altar. What you might do as a participant is you might wash your hands again and you'd gather around the altar. You would need to make sure that the animal gives consent to be killed. So you would either sprinkle some water over its head if you're from a Greek tradition, or you would sprinkle the mola salsa, a sort of grain mixture, over the head. The animal at this point would feel itch or some discomfort, so they would swing their head around, and you will be like, oh yeah, he's quite happy or she's quite happy to be sacrificed. Great, you've got the consent now. Poor animal. Anyhow, yes. So once you've tricked the animal into giving consent, this is typically what happens next. There's not really much of a difference between how the Greeks and Romans do it, so I'll try and go down the middle and see how it goes. Okay, so what you do is in fact, it's really hard to go down the middle, so I just let you have a look and then I'll give some brief comments. So do pause the video to note down anything or have a quick read. Okay, there are some common things here. The slitting of the throat, for example, and actually blood would typically be collected in a bowl anyway. The information that I've collected here are mostly from the textbook. So for the Roman parts, it likes to make sure that you know what a contrarius is, and perhaps a poppa as well. Yeah, this is what happens at the point of killing the animal, which may seem quite cruel. Once you've done that, you would make sure you offer up the parts for the gods. These are the thigh bones of the animal wrapped up with fat. I'll explain why this is chosen on the next slide. This is burnt as an offering on the altar, and wine would typically be poured on the offering as it burned. Then the entrails are taken for the haruspics to read the signs, to tell the future, to see what sort of messages the gods might be giving humankind at that point. And then for the rest of the meat will be divided up for the community. Sometimes this only takes place if the omens are good. For the Romans, they're quite hierarchical about it, so they make sure the priest gets it first. But for both the Greeks and the Romans, the sharing of the meat is an act of community. It's a sense of togetherness. We're sharing food together in this event. So in a way, the levels of hierarchy are sort of slightly broken as well, because everyone is having the same sort of food, doing the same thing. And meat eating is a very special thing for the Greeks and the Romans, because they don't eat as much let's just rephrase that. They don't eat as much meat as we do. Meat is not as significant a part of diet as it is for us. So it makes it a special occasion when they do have meat, which is what they do at these sort of sacrifice or festivals. Now, the reason why thigh bones wrapped up with fat are given to the gods is because, according to a Greek poet of 8th century BC, we think 8th century, he explains that on a certain occasion, gods and men met at a place called Mecone. The business of the assembly was to decide what portions of slain animals the gods should receive in sacrifice. Okay, so that's the agenda of the meeting, and what Prometheus, who's really on the god's side, really, or so he should be, but Prometheus is someone who always helps mankind. He arranged the best parts of the ox covered with offal, which are like it's not the most appetizing part. It's the sort of internal organs of the ox. And on the other portion, he wraps up the bones with fat. Now, what Zeus would have seen, I suppose, would be two options. One option is these sort of wastage bits of animal, and the other option is these really fatty parts. And when he saw the fatty parts, he thought that's going to be meat underneath there, and it's going to be a very generous, part of offering. So he chose the fats, but found only bones beneath. And this is how the meeting on what portion of slain animals the gods should receive in sacrifice was decided. This is how the gods and mankind decided which bits the god would want. Prometheus wasn't in Zeus's good books afterwards, but there are many other reasons for that. Okay, by this point you should have hopefully noted down the relevant information. So here are some of the tasks that you might wish to complete, and they're also on the worksheet as well. So here it is. Which method do you think is most appropriate for the following situation? Pause the video, have a go, and then we'll have a look. To be honest, there's no right or wrong answers here, but I suppose the most valid answers would be one that might consider the circumstances of the individuals and how much resources they have at their disposal, and also how significant the desires might be. So for these are my thoughts. For number one, I suppose a libation might be appropriate. Perhaps if he's really rich, then he might even offer a small set of sacrifice. But a prayer or a libation would probably be quite appropriate, and he might even offer a votive offering as well. Or he might, sometimes if you're in that situation, you might pray to say that if I make it over there in one piece, then I would offer you something in return. So you're kind of putting down a deposit in terms of a promise, and then your full payments would be given when you arrive at your destination. A child in love can't afford much. He might pray. I doubt he can get hold of wine. Sorry, she might pray. I doubt she could get hold of wine. So this child might offer some sort of prayer, or perhaps might offer some little object that might be significant to him or her, as in order to ask for the gods to be on side. If you're a state organizing a triumph, you're quite likely to order a state sacrifice with all the trimmings. The bigger the better, and you might not just offer up animal victims, but you might offer up some of the spoils of wars as well. Some of the important objects you've captured, that sort of thing. Blessings for a marriage, depending on the wealth of the person, it might be a sacrifice, or you might even just offer a votive offering. And finally, a festival organized by the state would probably involve some sort of state sacrifice. Now, having gone through 2 lessons on sacrifice, prayers, we're going to leave the 3rd lesson later on, which is on considering the significance of all this and consolidating it. There may or may not be a video for that. Either way, here are the final thoughts after 2 lessons and some questions for you. I'll leave them on there, and I'll let you think about it and bring to your own thoughts, so that if we were to meet in a lesson, we can consider these. I suppose one thing that I want to stress is that if you look back at the last slide, I think modern day people still wishes for certain things to happen. They might just not believe that the gods has a significant role to play about it, partly because people tend to be less religious in that sense, or more trusting of science, and the nature of religion has changed as well. So I am guessing that if I'm speaking to you and you're religious, you're probably more from a monotheistic background. You're probably not someone who believes in the existence of many gods. So these are the basis on which these final thoughts are made. As I've said, I look forward to hearing what you think about these questions, but for now I hope you've enjoyed and learned a lot about sacrifice and prayers, and if you do have any questions, do let me know, and hopefully I can point you at the right direction for finding those answers.